Hi, this is a repeat of Friday night's Zoom presentation. As you can see, it's about the Orb phenomenon. Orbs are, I suppose, to many people in the mainstream of paranormal research, kind of sidelined. They're not taken too seriously and are often dismissed as drops of water vapor or dust or some insect and so on and so forth. But some fairly serious-minded individuals have come out on the side of the genuineness of the phenomenon, as you can read from this quote. My first encounter with orbs, in the sense that the first time I took them seriously, was when Linda and I were photographing, or attempting to photograph, noctilucent clouds a few years ago. Back in the day, we only had simple point and click cameras. And she was in the front garden and I was in the back garden. As you can see, we captured exactly the same orb or glowing ball of light simultaneously from opposite sides of the houses. Only when we compared our end results that we noticed them. Since then, many times when we've been out in the field investigating other phenomena, these particular ones are taken in Rendlesham Forest. We've quite often photographed orbs, storms of orbs, single orbs, large orbs, and we've seen them as well, sometimes just when we're on our own, sometimes in company with other people. This large blue orb actually did drift across the path in front of us. It was really, really bright, and it was easy to photograph. I suppose it was about 30 centimetres across. Same with this one here. These are all large orbs photographed crossing, I think, track 10 in every case at Rendlesham Forest. And you can see they also vary in colour, not just texture and size, but colour too. Pink, blue, and white and green seem to be the most common that we see. And you do photograph and see insects. This is a swarm of insects on a summer's evening, and again down track 10 at Rendlesham. This is a bat. This is an even better picture of a bat. You can even see the insect it's chasing down here. So it wouldn't be true to say that every orb you ever see or photograph falls into that category. I should say that every single one of those previous photographs were taken on clear, cloudless nights with no obvious insects flying about, and we weren't certainly kicking up any dust. All right, again, I suppose my first introduction to the subject came from these two books back in the day, particularly Charles Eric Frank Russell book here. Eric Frank Russell is an English author that was working very active in the 50s and 60s, and this is one of the first science fiction books I read. And you might say, I suppose, that it had some kind of effect upon me, but it does concern itself, as you can see, with invisible entities with which we share the planet, and which have a far greater effect on humanity than is, understood or recognised by humanity. When you become kind of orb aware, if you like, you begin to notice orbs everywhere in culture and in history. It's quite often the case you see kings and other rulers represented holding an orb of some kind, but not always the ceremonial orb that you'll see the Queen carry, or King or Queen of England carry at a coronation, which is a kind of jewel encrusted with a crown on top and a cross, etc. Quite often you just see these translucent spheres, what look remarkably like crystal balls. In Chinese mythology, dragons are often represented either in sculpture or in paintings or enamels on pottery as clutching a large opalescent orb or pearl, which may, be interpreted as representing the moon or the sun, but it's still an orb, whichever way you look at it. This is a famous painting. It's been cleaned and restored beyond all recognition, probably, to what was originally painted by Leonardo da Vinci. It's called Salvator Mundi. It's actually no longer available for the public to look at. It's on a yacht owned by a Saudi prince who paid a world record sum for it recently. But you can see that Jesus is holding this translucent orb, and it has in it these three lights, which nobody really has so far been able to explain or interpret. Same pose, the same figure of Christ has been painted by many artists holding in the one on the right. It quite obviously is a representation of the globe. This is Africa, that's the Gulf of Arabia. This presumably is Sri Lanka, or perhaps they thought India was an island. But as well as these representations in art, they're actually found all over the world in the form of these enormous stone spheres. Now, it would be easy to assume that these are some kind of natural phenomenon, volcanic or some such, or erosion features, but they're not. They've been investigated by archaeologists. Now found, particularly these ones in Costa Rica, have been discovered to be human artifacts that have been made by people in the past. And then some are found on the beaches in Costa Rica too. And that's how big they are. This is unless that's an extremely small female, but that's one of these Costa Rican stone spheres. There is a tradition, of course, for megalithic carving. Those stone heads made by people like the Olmecs in the Toltecs, but the purpose and interpretation of these is still so far unknown. But they're found elsewhere too. This particular one, it was from Bosnia, and there are others associated with it, but Bosnia, as some of you may know, has what appear to be large prehistoric pyramids that are so ancient that they're covered with soil and vegetation now, and they're not. I wouldn't say they're widely accepted as being man-made, but there's plenty of evidence from local archaeologists that they are. They've burrowed into them and found they have structures inside them, tunnels, and other artifacts have been found deep inside them. But anyway, these stone spheres, which again are artifacts, are found in Bosnia. This one's in Kazakhstan. It's a phenomenon that's found throughout the world in the same way that our ancestors portrayed gods or kings, pharaohs, other potentates. It seems they were also prone to making carvings of these huge stone spheres. More up to date, it's recorded in American history that before the Battle of Valley Forge, which was an extremely significant battle in the American War of Independence, George Washington was somewhat trepidatious about the coming events, and he went off to meditate, it's said, and it's reported. He reported that he was spoken to, received comfort and advice from a large orb of light that appeared as he was kneeling down meditating. You should know that George Washington, like many American presidents, was actually quite heavily involved in the paranormal or arcane society. He was, in fact, a 33rd Archmason, like many American presidents were. As I say, when you think about orbs, the more you become orb aware, the more you see them in everyday circumstances. This is a familiar clip for those or scene from those of us who were around in the 50s or in the 60s. This is actually from the mid to late 60s, I think. It's Patrick McGowan in a TV series that was a global success, actually. It was just a strange and very bizarre. I think he only made one or two series of it. It was called The Prisoner, and it was to do with secret agents who'd been taken for debriefing or some kind of reassessment to this very strange Italian village, which of course was, most people know, situated on the coast of Wales, where they were kept in check and stopped from escaping, etc., by these enormous orbs that follow them around everywhere, and in fact were capable of killing you if necessary. And such a strange concept, but nobody at the time seemed to comment on the fact. It was just kind of accepted. However, a more usual or more up-to-date film is what are known as, to students of these paranormal, as light forms. These are large orbs, UFO-like in a way, and they tend to, and they interact or follow human beings. A friend of mine actually was having a quiet read in a car park on the South Downs near Beltute Lighthouse, and his car was flooded with orange light. He looked out the window, and there across the field, this is a representation of it, was this enormous orange sphere giving off light, intense light. And this is a guy who's very pragmatic, and he's a big bloke too. I think he had a fairly ambivalent feelings about the paranormal, but he was forced to change them. This thing actually, he was fairly worried by it, and drove out the car park quickly. This all followed him down the road, this light form, for some distance. It was only when he reached the main road in an accelerated way he managed to escape from it. You could still see it in the distance. I know it changes his attitudes a lot to UFOs and the paranormal in general. There is a phenomenon, a natural phenomenon called ball lightning, which is often cited as being a probable cause or a possible cause of the Orb phenomenon. But I don't buy into that, because ball lightning is a very rare phenomenon. It's a plasma, okay, that has only been briefly, when I say briefly, I mean literally seconds in a laboratory, and they're very small, maybe 5-10 centimeters would be a big one. It's only been done a handful of times as well. And in nature, ball lightning is it's probably more mysterious than UFO landings, more rare, because it's literally only ever seen a handful of times a year. And even then, it's very, very short-lived. These photographs were taken presumably by photographers out getting pictures of a thunder and lightning storm. They're very often, ball lightning seems to be associated with, quite often, with electronic devices like substations or transformers and so on and so forth. My sister-in-law was fortunate enough, and I do mean that, I'm quite envious of this, to be in a cafe in Kent. She looked out the window, and there was a large translucent glowing sphere moving around on the surface of a transformer in the car park of this restaurant where she was. And again, there was a sudden flash, and all the lights in the restaurant went down, and in the neighborhood there was a power cut that lasted for some time. So it was obviously related to it. Now, one of my books is concerned itself with this subject, and it's an attempt to do for the paranormal what people like Einstein were attempting to do for physics, which is to create a unified field theory, if you like. When you consider the actual universe in which we live, it's a construct. It's an interplay between electrical fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields, and other forces. There are much weaker forces associated too. And physicists, astronomers, cosmologists have been, for 100 years, have been attempting to make sense of the way the universe behaves and how it's constructed, and the interplay between the particles in it. Now, the standard model of the universe looks at conventional, our vision of the universe as seen, as taught us when we were kids at school. The stars made up of atoms and planets made up of atoms. The atoms themselves are constructed of particles, fundamentally, electrons, protons, and neutrons, which are held in place by various weak and strong nuclear force, etc., etc., etc. And that the gravity, which funnily enough is one of the weaker forces of the three main ones. If you doubt that, just ask yourself, think about this. If you hold a magnet above a pin, the pin jumps up to the magnet against the pull of the entire planet Earth. So electromagnetism is actually a very strong force. And that standard model of the universe is fine, and it seems to apply to the macro universe, so that the galaxies, stars, and planets. In the early 20th century, physicists like Niels Bohr realized that it didn't really hold true for the structure of what's going on inside atoms, and the theory of quantum theory, quantum mechanics, and the associated mathematics was devised. I mean, I'm not going to. It's quite hard to explain. Once you get a tag on it, it's fascinating. But it again in itself, it's Einstein and Bohr and people like that were attempting to unify, bring together the standard model of the universe and quantum theory, and neither of them really were successful. Successfully explain what was observed. Of course, the problem is there's a what's called the uncertainty principle in physics, which is if you observe something, you change the way it behaves, which may sound bizarre, but if you think about it, it's almost like if you shine the light on a woodlouse, it scuttles under the bush. And it's the same with particles. If you shine a beam of light on them, which is electromagnetic radiation, it actually affects the particle that you're shining it on. Okay, it increases its energy and so on and so forth. So within the last 30 years or so, the new theory arrived called string theory, which attempted to make sense of all this by saying that particles, the things that we assume to, we've always taken to be particles, like, for example, I don't know if you know that light can be, in some ways, it behaves like a wave phenomenon, like an electromagnetic wave. In other ways, when it's, for example, reflected, it behaves like a particle, which are called photons. And so string theory attempts to explain this apparent dichotomy by suggesting that what we're actually observing as strings, these fields are actually strings, which one-dimensional strings, which can alter or change their behavior. It's the unified gravity, electromagnetism, so change their behavior, but change their physics according to how fast they're vibrating and the frequency of that, the frequency of the vibration, also the amplitude of it. But even that didn't seem to, and it also, of course, presupposes more than one. We inhabit a three-dimensional universe. String theory presupposes more than one reality and many more dimensions than we're familiar with. And the latest idea is what's called the D-brain, or the brain theory, which says that, which again presupposes or requires the existence of many, many parallel universes and many, many dimensions, and that most of us are comfortable with attempting to understand. Well, I suggest we could do the same thing. The problem we have in researching the paranormal, you have ghosts, you have religious apparitions such as visions of the Virgin Mary and so on and so forth, bleeding statues and Ganesh, statues of Ganesh that drink milk. Then you have lake monsters, Ogopogo, the Loch Ness monster, sea serpents and so on. Then elementals such as goblins, elves, pixies, fairies, and hominids, ape-like or giant primitive-looking human beings such as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Almas, and so on, and Yeti and so on. And then, of course, UFOs. Now, for the man in the street who lives his normal everyday life, he watches Freeview at night, and you have all these different paranormal phenomena. It undoubtedly seems as if, the one, looking at any one of them tends to bring the rest of them in a sense. Supposing, for example, you met somebody who claimed to have had a very close encounter with the UFO, and then, as happened in the film Close Encounters, as a matter of fact, and then casually says, I saw a Bigfoot last week. It's a strange fact that people who see any one of these tend to see others as well. I mean, I'm not embarrassed to admit that I've seen ghosts. I have done since I was a child, very young. And I've I went to Loch Ness back in the 1970s, early 1970s, with a colleague to write a book about a Loch Ness monster. We were both scientists. I'm a biologist. He was a chemist, and our intention was to disprove the whole thing. And in fact, to a large extent, we did. We interviewed most of the witnesses and found they, under close scrutiny, their stories didn't hang together. In fact, many of them admitted they were fakes, and famously people like Ted Holiday and people like that. He was found out, and I'm sure that and the famous surgeon's photograph, I think most people know, and the McNabb picture, but unfortunately for us, while we were on our way to have a chat with another researcher at the time who was writing a book, Nick Witchell, who's now the BBC Royal Correspondent. Then he was just a student at Birmingham University. As we were driving along the lock to meet him, we looked out and there it was, large as life and twice as ugly. The famous upturned boat shape swimming along. You can see the splash of its paddle. So even though logic and all kinds of scientific research that we did at the time proved there couldn't possibly be a large animate object, never mind a whole herd of them, we actually saw one. So, the thing is, it seems that there are far too many different flavors of the paranormal for all or any of them to be true. And I think that's often used by the TV companies to dismiss the whole thing or to ridicule it. So I think we should, for a long time I've been thinking about, is there a way of unifying the whole thing? Just a quick bit of astronomy here. The oldest stars, the first stars, were what known as population 3 or first generation stars. And they condensed from the hydrogen that was generated by the uncoupling of matter after the Big Bang, okay? And those stars lived their lives and then eventually went nova or supernova, exploded, and through there, the hydrogen and the other products of nuclear fusion that have gone on inside their cores, such as helium and lithium, possibly as large atoms as carbon, they were all thrown off into the universe, formed clouds of gas and dust, which condensed to form the next generation, the population 2 stars, which are 5 to 10 billion years old. And the Pop2 stars, in their solar furnaces, produced bigger and bigger atoms up to the ones that make up the periodic table we all learned at school. So they're really right up to the really giant atoms like uranium and plutonium and so on and so forth. And of course, those stars also, the oldest and earliest of those, also burned out their hydrogen and collapsed in themselves and maybe exploded through their outer shells up into the cosmos. And then you get the population 1, the third generation stars, okay, which would include our sun. Our sun is either a Pop2 or Pop1 star. It's on the kind of a boundary between them. But these are stars, all of these stars, Pop2 and Pop1 stars, will have condensed from solar nebulae to produce a star at the center of a planetary system. When I did my astronomy degree a long time ago, it was considered highly likely that our solar system was virtually unique, which was a very good way of sidestepping the issue about how common life was in the universe. We now know that planets and planetary systems are very, very common. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds have been discovered and observed, often by looking at the way a planet will occult or pass in front of a bright star and cause a dimming of it, but in other ways as well. But it's now known there are even planets that just wander around in interstellar space. Planets appear to be very, very common out there in the universe. And so therefore, on those planets, we can assume, I refuse to accept or believe for 1 minute that life on Earth is unique, is a unique product. I think it's happened wherever there's the slightest chance, in any planet in what's called the Goldilocks zone, circling a star, where water can exist as a liquid and where there's oxygen and an atmosphere, as was the case on Mars until comparatively recently, as we know from looking at the photographs from various Mars probes. I think life will have appeared, and I think life is super hyper abundant out there. Whether it comes to visit us is another discussion. But human beings have only been around on the planet a very short time. If you represent the Earth as the Earth's history since its formation just over 4 billion years ago, human beings and human civilization did not appear if you represent the whole of the Earth as one day, we didn't appear until 9 seconds before midnight. I mean, thinking about it, there must be countless races out there in the universe, much, much older than us. The famous Green Bank equation predicts that, while that's probably the case, you have to take into account that once any culture or society or civilization gets clever enough, they might well destroy themselves with nuclear warfare, as nearly happened several times on Earth. That when travel across the surface of the planet becomes cheap and easy to carry out, as we've seen over the last 2 years, you run the risk of pandemics wiping out the population. It just so happens that COVID, at the moment, isn't that serious in the sense that it hasn't killed a large percentage of the global population. But supposing that pandemic had been on the order of Ebola or Lassa fever, then things could have been a lot different. So it could be that it's unfortunately the destiny of all advanced civilizations to die out, or many of them. But if they do survive, where would evolution take them? Now look at this little chart here. The energy, where human beings, like all animals and plants, are basically just machines for converting energy. Now, if you look at us, all the food we pack into our face every day, look where it goes. 30 to 50% is used for movement. That's just moving around looking for food, effectively. Whether it's earning a living to go and buy it, or if you're a hunter-gatherer actually looking for it. Food transport and digestion, that's pushing the food down your gut, digesting it. It's a chemical process. It requires energy. Also, bear in mind that once the stuff has been broken down into small enough molecules, it has to be transported from the bloodstream into the tissue beds, and there it's got to be transported into the cells. I mean, cell division requires protein, and that movement of chemicals around the body, active transport through cell membranes and so on and so forth, requires energy, a lot of energy. The thermoregulation, just keeping us warm, if you have so-called warm-blooded creatures like us, like birds, then that 30 to 50, nearly half of the energy we get from our food is used to keep warm. And look, just a tiny fragment, around 1% of the energy we use is we produce goes into actual process of thinking, the bit that we're most proud of, that human beings are, allegedly separates us from the animals. In other words, 99% of the food we eat is used just to keep our physical body alive. Now, supposing we didn't need a physical body, supposing we could directly absorb energy from other sources, then in that case, you also wouldn't need, I'm sure most people are aware that we get energy from a class of foods or chemicals called carbohydrates, and to digest carbohydrates through what's called the carboxylic acid cycle, we use oxygen. That's why we breathe it in. All living things do, apart from one or two simple slimes and things which do what's called, like yeast, for example, do what's called anaerobic respiration. But everything else requires oxygen to get energy from its food. Now, if you didn't need food, or if you didn't have a physical body, required so much energy, if you could just directly get the energy from in some other way, you wouldn't need to go around looking for food, you wouldn't need a physical body, and you wouldn't need oxygen. In other words, you could live in outer space. And as I say, all life on Earth, all we do is transform one form of energy into another. I mean, the classic, we'll say, is plants that take electromagnetic energy, in other words, sunlight, certain elements of sunlight, wavelengths, they turn it into chemical energy. In fact, they turn it into chemicals. They use the sunlight through the process of photosynthesis to make sugars, starches, proteins, and fats. And of course, that's called autotrophism, actually making your own food. Holotrophic organisms like us then take advantage of that by eating them. And we take the chemical energy and we turn it to kinetic energy for movement and so on and so on. So everything is just transforming energy from one form or another. Now, if you take electromagnetic energy, start with a really long wavelength, radio waves, getting shorter and shorter and shorter wavelengths, greater and greater, higher frequency. In the middle of all that is a bunch of wavelengths that are used by most life on Earth, this bunch here, the spectrum of visible light. We use it to find our way around. Okay, plants use part of it, the red end of the spectrum. Green plants, anyway, use the red end of the spectrum for photosynthesis. Of course, red plants use the green end of the spectrum. So seaweeds, deep water seaweeds and things, shallow water seaweeds are green, so they use the red light, but deep water seaweeds are red, so they soak up, they use the green end of the spectrum. But it's only this part of the spectrum that's used by plants to make all the food used by all the plants, all the animals on the planet. Of this huge bunch of amount of energy that reaches us from the sun and from the rest of the cosmos, only this tiny part of it. We're aware of ultraviolet, it's what makes us go brown, and many insects, I believe, including bees and so on and so forth, some birds even, use ultraviolet to, in the same way as we use visible light, they can see by ultraviolet. Infrared, well, we're aware of it. It's the feeling when you put your hand near a hot plate, the heat you can feel is infrared radiation. Okay, microwaves of what cook your baked beans in the morning. So it's only a tiny part of all this energy that falls on us. Down this end, you've got the high frequency, very short wavelength radiation. Gamma radiation is what's given off by radioactive decay. X radiation, as you know, is incredibly penetrating, goes through flesh and bones and so on and so forth, very damaging, high energy radiations. So supposing some of these very, very ancient races from population 2 stars, suppose they've evolved to actually no longer need a physical form. They can absorb the parts of the EM radiation they need, as we do, from including, I've suggested here, including emissions produced by human thought or intelligent thought. They can absorb it directly. Our conscious minds, this is somebody wired up to, for some reason, a Russian is wired up to an encephalograph, and it's measuring his brain activity. Now, what he's producing is electric fields, changes in electric fields, and that's to be measured with an ECG. And it's actually an energy output. And if you're stimulated, if you're excited, frightened, whatever, any of these 5 boys, a hideous little toad, isn't he? He wants a good slapping, really. But any of these, any human activity will increase our brain activity, and that will actually release electrical field energy. Might these ancient energy vampires use this directly as their source of energy, and might they actually, when they during their swimming across the cosmos, bump onto an inhabited planet like ours, might they then stimulate our emotional output so they can tuck in and have a good feed? And how might they do this? Well, this is where the paranormal comes in. Ghosts, sea monsters, you know, yetis and so on, UFOs. You think if you went to a house that you were told was haunted, you wouldn't even have to see a ghost to have some kind of outpouring of emotional energy. During my time at Loch Ness, I was amazed to see the people piling up in cars or this is actually true, you know, coaches full of Oriental visitors from Japan particularly, but China too, would pile out of their coaches with their cameras and binoculars clicking away, and in a higher state of excitement, what's called alert expectation. And if you were walking through the woods in Oregon or Washington State, you know, you might have this thought in your mind that you're going to see a Bigfoot. Without even seeing one, you're already producing much higher, much greater brain activity. And the same is true with UFOs. I guarantee if you were to visit Roswell, if you were to visit Rendlesham Forest, I've been to Rendlesham Forest, I mean, 50 years after the actual event, you know, it happened in 1980, and here we are in 2012, 40 years after the actual event, people still go there with this high level of alert expectation. They walk through the woods at night, they get all excited, and strange things do happen there. But the thing you're more likely to see than anything else is an orb. Sports, all organized sports, you know, it's a kind of tribal activity. And you imagine that this is a Super Bowl, you know, but it could be the FA Cup, it could be a cricket game. huge amounts of energy are generated from the outpourings of excitement, anticipation, or disappointment. Warfare, big wars, little wars, brush wars, even just the anticipation of war. I mean, when I was a little kid, having to do duck and cover in my classroom in London, I assure you, there was a lot of frightened kids, lots of, scared children and adults too. It's probably it's the oldest and most widespread human activity is fighting each other. And even gang warfare in the big cities and so on and so forth. I think the energy that outpours and religious experiences, whether it's a visit by the Pope or to a Latin American city or country, or visiting a sacred site, even somewhere like let's be honest, in like Glastonbury Tor or something like that, or Roslin Chapel. Or in this particular case, we have the Fatima experience at the start of the 20th century, when some young children, 3 young children in Portugal, claimed to have been spoken to by the Virgin Mary. And she predicted when she'd next come, only the children could see her, but on the last occasion, and as you can see, it drew an enormous crowd. She claimed that she would give proof of what she was communication with the children was genuine. And all these people there, every single one of them claimed that the sun suddenly grew large and silver and moved around the sky and span. They call it the solar miracle, it was called. And it was witnessed by literally hundreds of thousands of people. And the one of the children, the oldest girl, wrote down what the Virgin Mary allegedly told her in the form of 3 letters, which were eventually found their way to the Pope. And the 2 of them have been, I believe, made public. The 3rd hasn't, and it's got all kinds of dire prophecies for mankind. So supposing you're one of these energy beings, one of these, as I say, energy vampires, all you've got to do is appear, just manifest yourself in some form, and like a kind of shape changer, manifest yourself in some form that will have an impact on these 3 little children, and allow them to whip up, as in this case, a tremendous excitement. You don't even have to appear again. And even the prophecy, look at down the ensuing 150 years, look at the amount of fear and thought and trepidation and speculation that surround that 3rd letter. So, because of this principle of low expectation, these energy beings they only need to manifest themselves very infrequently. Most of the time, they just hang around areas where, supposing you went to the Tower of London, you already know that there's this tremendous reputation for executions and torture and stuff like that, right up until the time of the Second World War. If occasionally an energy being just puts in an appearance as a headless Anne Boleyn wandering across the lawn, and let's do it once in a while, then that alert expectation is always going to be there. The same at Loch Ness, the same at Lake Monica, or the various lake monsters, the same at Roswell, the same at anywhere that's got a reputation for paranormal activities, haunted houses, or anything like that. You think of cathedrals, big cathedrals. And I remember when I was a kid, a friend Richard and I, we used to sometimes go and stand in the middle of Romford Marketplace and just stare upwards. And then one of us would say, "Look, there it is." And people would turn around and look, and they'd all come and stand around, look up, and you'd point, and you could slink away and leave quite a large crowd after you'd gone. And I often think, if what I've even a part of what I've postulated is true, you can see that the old energy beings would have loved that. Here's just to sum up evidence that orbs do exist. They seem to have been recorded in art and tradition for thousands of years, as we've seen. They have been photographed, though not just by people keen to prove their existence. So I had photographed orbs long before I knew anything about them or thought about them really. And they can be seen. They're not just photographic artifacts of dust and raindrops and mist and stuff. They can be seen, and some credible witnesses have seen them. And also they have been reliably recorded as responding to human activity. I remember once being in Rendlesham Forest with a couple of the locals, and they said, if you want to really see orbs well, if you do quiet whistles, like they'll cluster up to you, and believe it or not, they did. It was incredible. Not only did we see some, we actually photographed them. Whether that's frequently observed, I don't know, but they're often associated with strange mists that actually appear. These mists are not people breathing out. I took these photos, or Linda did, and the mist kind of appeared on this is a summer's evening. No, this is not our exhaled breath. And as you can see, well, as we watch, these orbs kind of coalesced in the mist in front of us. And the final thought, but I will just offer a word of caution to myself as well, as researchers or students of the paranormal, which we all are, we will be watching this, it's essential that we take every care to identify and eliminate data we're presented with, which is fraudulent. There's a lot of fakers out there. Mischievous, that's people who do it for a laugh to discredit the whole thing. Or dubious, that's where what appears to be a genuinely taken photograph of something, such as I would say some of those photographs of ball lightning, probably not what they purport to be. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and look out for some more of my ramblings in the future. Thanks a lot. Bye now.